This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
Thank you and good morning. In the late 1970s, a teenage boy was sent to live at a facility in Fullerton here in Adelaide. After 3 months, he was allowed to go home for the weekend. But after just a few hours, he was impatient to return to his new home, which he shared with 700 other people with disability. The Home for Incurables, as it was then called, made Brenton happy. He lived with people his own age, and there was always someone to interact with. As an adult and a fierce Adelaide Crows supporter, a highlight of Brenton's life was the fortnightly minibus trip to Footy Park to watch his team train. Sadly, Brenton died a few years ago, but his father retains a strong attachment to the place that his son called home for more than 30 years. And I thank him for letting me share just a little of his story today. There are now only about 100 people living at what was the Home for Incurables, then the Julia Farr Centre, and what's now called Highgate Park. And it may well close in the next 10 years if it follows the path of other institutions for people with disability. The period in which the routine institutionalisation of people with disability was deemed to be in their best interest was quite a unique stage in our history, and built on assumptions that we now accept to be flawed. But many hundreds of South Australians called residential facilities like Highgate Park home, and we have a fleeting opportunity to hear firsthand of the lived experience of people who were directly affected by that policy, however it happened and however it is remembered. But these people are ageing, and if we're not careful, the opportunity to record their stories will be lost. So I'm interested in what place oral history can play here. If oral history is about collecting stories that are representative of the human condition, of people generally, not just the famous or the infamous, and people with disability are one of the most underrepresented groups in our society, oral history should be a promising vehicle for collecting their stories. If we take a look at some commonly accepted definitions of oral history, I think there's a fairly good fit, and I've taken these from the Oral History Handbook. Oral history is a picture of the past in people's own words. A practical definition of oral history is a recorded interview in question and answer format conducted by an interviewer who has some knowledge of the subject to be discussed with a knowledgeable interviewee speaking from first-hand experience on subjects of historical interest, and that is made accessible to other researchers. But at first glance, the word oral could be quite distancing for some people with disability. Is oral history mainly about the way that it's spoken, the way that words are given character and layers of meaning when they're voiced? And I know that there are papers on tomorrow's program that look at just that issue. Because not everyone uses spoken language. Some people use a pointer to select letters or words or symbols on a communication board, and we want all people to have the opportunity to tell of their lives in the way that's intrinsic for them. So I wonder if the term oral history is really more about the way it sets itself apart from other forms of history, such as written or artefact history. And perhaps a word like intrinsic would be seen as important here, in that it refers to the way in which a person naturally expresses themselves. So, would the aims of oral history be any different for people with disability compared to people without disability? And my only comments would be that firstly, the opportunity to reflect on and tell about our lived experience is an important part of our self-concept, our validation and our understanding. And opportunities for people with disability to do this have often been incredibly minimal. Our community's history is incomplete without the perspectives and the details of the lives of people with disability, and decisions around services and government policy should always be informed by the lived experience of people with disability and people who live with them. So how could we collect an oral history from someone who uses sign language or a manual communication board? Who would do the interviewing? How would the interview be recorded? How would we seek informed consent for an interview from a person with an intellectual disability? And are projects funded sufficiently to pay for appropriately skilled interviewers or the additional training that's required? I'm not a historian, but I've worked on a couple of relevant projects where I've been heavily involved in the planning stages, and I've tried to identify here and sort some of the issues that may need to be considered when we're collecting oral history from people with disability, and isn't an exhaustive list. The first is around ethics and informed consent processes. Relative positions of power are really, really important here, and we need to be sure that people are agreeing to interview independently and in full knowledge of the implications, and that's often really difficult to tease out, and it may take considerable time. Who will actually seek consent and what is their relative position of power with the potential interviewee? Is an advocate required for the person with disability, and who should that be? Are the consent forms intelligible to potential interviewees? And perhaps thinking particularly about people with intellectual disabilities. And would it be possible to reframe them in simple English if needed? I've had a go at some of that, but I'm not really clear about what the legal implications are then. How are judgments made about a person's storytelling scope or potential in the first place? And how thoroughly are the person's communication skills really understood? And is a speech pathology assessment required? And there's another layer. Choice of interviewer is also really important. It's vital that the interviewer interpret the communication method, obviously, of the interviewee quickly and reliably. And does that interviewer have sufficient credibility with the interviewee? The most appropriate recording method may not be an audio recorder. Could be a video recorder, perhaps. And if an alternative communication device uses some kind of specific output, then obviously that will be really important to be preserved as well. And that leads to what forms of storage are required and how things might be co-stored, co-located, and what potential translations or transcriptions. It's important that we preserve that verifiable source material and not just translations or transcriptions of it, but there's also the issue of who decides whether the interview is actually going to be translated or transcribed. Some signing systems are seen by their users as being quite superior to English in spoken or written form, and they may well prefer that it's not actually translated. And I guess in terms of access, we have implications because then will your potential audience be limited because of that? So I think it's fairly clear from that list of considerations why it is that many large projects often can't afford to include people with disability. But I guess that's my point here, that we keep missing them out. What exists in the literature, and I'm sure this is not exhaustive, but just a bit of an indication. Jan Gothard is an oral historian in Western Australia who's done extensive work researching in the area of Down syndrome. History of Kew cottages in Victoria, it's a fairly recent example. Karen Hirsch's article on the role of our oral history, which was in the Oral History Review in 1995. And Disability Voices is an oral history collection on the British Library website. But again, that does only focus on people who are relatively articulate. What is happening in South Australia right now? It's not that there's no impetus. There are people who would love to see major work done here, certainly including Brenton's father. And these are a few projects that I'm aware of. The Tutti Incorporated project, Their Shadows in Us, which is a multi-arts initiative, and that involved interviews with many past residents of Minda, and their exhibition is going to be opening in December this year. Find and Connect project, which Karen has obviously been talking about, and a couple of projects that are currently being run by Denise Wood, who's presenting with me today.
Thanks, Leeston. So I want to sort of give a human face, if you like, to some of the issues that Leeston's just pointed out. And in doing so, I will refer to a two-stage project, the first of which was funded, interestingly enough, by Telstra, who were really interested in the potential of tablet computers, particularly iPads and so forth, to improve communication for people with disabilities. They were particularly interested in older generation and the implications of these technologies for the older generation. And the second stage to that being a collaborative project with Disabilities SA, Department of Communities and Social Inclusion, at Highgate Park, which aims to bring the private narratives to bear on public disability policy. And there are some tensions in trying to bring these two aspects of the project together, because obviously the organisations that are keen for us to pursue this research have their own particular agendas as well. So one of the reasons that we were particularly interested in the first stage of the project was, as Leeston talked about in her stage of the presentation, to be able to give a voice to those who are not able to speak for themselves. So when Disability SA first asked us to be involved with this project, their request was for us to write the history of Highgate Park from the perspective of current and former residents of that institution. And my first question to them was, well, how do we hear from the voices of those who currently have no means of communication? And they didn't have an answer for that. And their only solution was to interview their family or their carers or staff at the institution. And I guess I don't need to elaborate on some of the implications if they are our only sources of the voices of these people. So fortunately, at around the same time that this request came, the emergence of iPads hit the market. And particularly what we were interested in is the universal design principles of iPads, which meant that there are a lot of inbuilt assistive technology solutions within these devices that would allow these people potentially to be able to speak, quote marks, speak for themselves. And so we teamed up with various organisations and companies, including Therapy Box Apps in the UK, who have developed this particular software that you can see on the iPad called Predictable, which is text prediction software, which enables someone who has fairly limited communication to be able to write their stories fairly effectively and then to speak what they have written verbally. So we were interested in two aspects. We first of all really wanted to know whether the iPad itself would be a useful assistive technology for these people, as well as a tool for collecting oral histories. The second stage of the project, we are only just moving into some 2 years down the track, because I think we had underestimated the magnitude of the work that's involved with working intensively with the sorts of people that have been involved in the first stage of the project. For the first stage, we actually wanted some instruments that would help us to identify how effective the tools were. And these are some of the assessment tools that we used. I'm not going to go into detail now because we don't have time to do so, but we have published the first stage of the project involving 5 participants and 2 participant researchers, which I'll talk about in a moment, in a Telstra special edition of the Telecommunications Journal of Australia in May, which is open access, and you can access that if you're interested. But our participants involved 2 cohorts. First of all, adult residents at Highgate Park who have complex communication needs. And the second group were a couple of co-researchers who are adults with complex communication needs who were our co-researchers. In fact, the research for the first group has morphed into them also being co-researchers, because what we eventually decided to do was, as we were developing the proposal for the book was to turn it from what was going to be a book that we wrote to a book that they are writing. Now, the reason for that is very strategic, because I talked about the mixed stakeholder investment in the project. And one of our concerns came about when we sought ethics approval, because the ethics approval actually states that the minister has the right of final veto over anything that is said and published from the histories of these people. So we chose to, for the second stage of the project, to, in our ethics application, state quite clearly that this would be an edited publication with chapters written by the participants themselves, because it's much harder to silence an author, especially if they are a co-author of a book. I talked about the participatory research design. We believe it's very important for the people with disabilities to be regarded as co-researchers. Of course, that raises a number of other issues, but in our view, their voice, their experience is something only they can bring to the project. It's a richness that we haven't got the first-hand experience of. And so it's particularly popular now in disability field for participants to now be regarded as co-researchers, elevating them to a similar status to our own, and thereby hoping to reduce some of the power imbalances. Here's quickly a summary of the first 5 of the participants. We've got 10 in all, but these were the first 5 we worked with. The first, a male who had been in the institution for more than 20 years with locked-in syndrome as a result of a stroke. The second, a male with hearing impairment and intellectual disability, and Leeston touched on some of the challenges ethically in working with some of people with intellectual disability. The third, a mature woman who has been in the institution again for over 20 years. The fourth, delightful 86-year-old woman with cerebral palsy who spent most of her life in institutions. And the last of our participants, someone with a male with acquired brain injury, mild impairments, in fact, turned out to be more significant issues for him than we originally imagined. I'm not going to go into, because we don't have time, but I really want to point out a few significant things that we found so far with working with these people with a range of different technologies. First of all, those who do have family or friends and time to sit with them have been able to achieve more. That's perhaps not a surprising finding, but it's been very, very obvious in this project. For some, having the piece of technology that gives them a voice has been an incredibly important part of their lives. And I quote here from our 86-year-old, iPad is the best thing that's ever happened to me, which says a lot for her life. But I hasten to add that it's much more than the bit of technology, of course. It's a couple of things. First of all, people have been coming to visit her and spend time with her and listen to her story. The second is that for the first time she's been able to articulate the story. And that's a profound change in this individual person's life. Staff and family have been generally very supportive, and it's opened up new avenues for communication and recreation and social connection for these people. Lots of challenges. I guess the most important finding we had was these people are still in an institution that we're working with. There's still a power imbalance for these people. So there's a limitation on how much of their story they feel able to share. There's also a physical limitation on how they're able to even access their device, even though the technology is available to them now. We titled the paper that we published in the Telecommunications Journal of Australia, "If you leave it with me, I will work it out." And that's a direct quote from one of the participants. And what's that quote about? Well, over the Christmas period last year, we weren't down at Highgate Park. We took a couple of weeks off. When we came back, none of the iPads had been used in the whole time. that we were away. And we didn't want to put words in our participants' mouths, so we sort of fished around and we said, well, you were on holidays, I guess, you went out a lot more, didn't have time. No, they were very clear that that was not the reason they had not been using the iPad. The reason they'd not been using the iPad was no one got them out of the locked cabinet for them. So even when you give people the technology to be able to share their stories, they're still in a powerless position. Part of the problem is lack of consistency in staff. So we train the staff, but the staff come and go every day. So therein lies one of the challenges. So that participant's quote to us was when we came back and we said, do you want us to spend more time training you on how to use the device? And he said, no, just give it to me. I can work it out if I have access to the technology. The staff really are only caring for their physical needs, not their social needs. All sorts of challenges that we hadn't envisaged. One of our participants got a new wheelchair. In the process, he was without his device for the whole period because it was mounted on the tray of the wheelchair. When he got a new wheelchair and it came back, it had repositioned him and he could no longer access the iPad. You can imagine the sorts of frustrations that these people are experiencing when they're all keen to write their own stories, to write their own histories. Leeston touched on the lack of funding. We've had to beg, borrow, steal to be able to provide the devices for these people, even simple things like a mount for it. But we've also discovered lots of limitations with iPads that we're still exploring. So I guess what we found is the importance, if we are going to hear from the people themselves, then one of the things that we need to be aware of is the level of training that is required for these people before we can actually get to their actual stories. The many benefits, but the huge challenges in adapting the use of these technologies for people with complex needs. The third point is one that I have to emphasise the strongest, the impact of institutionalisation on self-efficacy, the whole notion of learned helplessness. And perhaps the most vivid example of that was when a carer came into the room of one of our participants while my research assistant was with her and started to go through her handbag without her permission. And when the carer had left the room, the participant turned to the research assistant and said, with her iPad. And she said, but the research assistant said, why didn't you say something while the person was doing it? And she couldn't. Okay, so that will give you a sense of how it's going to be very difficult to get to the depth of their stories because they are still in a position where they lack power and they are very acutely aware of that lack of power. There are new emerging technologies. For example, that gentleman that I mentioned in locked-in syndrome, he needs eye-gaze communication. All the technologies we use with the iPad would not give him the degree of control he needs, but the new Windows 8 tablets will support eye gaze. That means even though this gentleman can only use his eyes, he is able to write his story. One of the remarkable things we found is all of those participants have already started to write their stories in whatever way they can. And so these technologies are now allowing them to flourish, but within some of those existing constraints. And we have to be very well aware when we are editing and working with them on the books that there will always be a degree of silence that the people themselves have chosen to impose on their own stories. And perhaps the only way we'll ever get to the depth of those stories is when those people have left the institution. But even then, as Karen said, it's going to be very difficult for some of them to ever feel comfortable to completely share their full stories. But I think this at least shows us that the emerging technologies do give us a tool to at least enable people to share their stories firsthand rather than through the through the voices of their carers, of their family members, or of institutions. Thank you.
What a fabulous project. And we have time for 2 questions. 1, 2. It was a near miss. I had to count who was first.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. My name's Sue Anderson. I'm editor of the Oral History Association Journal, and this is more a comment than a question. I just wanted to alert you to the fact that there is an article in the journal that's just been released by Aaron Payne on oral histories with the deaf, and
Yes.
I thought you picked that up.
We're aware
That's
of
all
that.
I wanted to say.
Yes,
Thank you.
Yes, excellent.
Wondering whether the co-researchers with CCN get paid as co-researchers, co-authors.
In some of the projects I've worked with, we've had a budget to be able to do that. As Marion knows, as someone who's involved with this project, we have struggled to get any level of funding beyond what Telstra provided us, which bought them their iPads, has bought them the interface technologies. So while they haven't been paid in sort of cash, they have received the iPads that they keep forever. They've received free internet access for a year. We've, amongst ourselves, bought them whatever switching devices they've needed, and they've had, of course, had the time of someone that sits with them and has worked with them and has often bought their maps. So not in terms of cash, purely because, but I hasten to add, we did actually apply for ARC funding. We weren't successful in the round that we went for, and we had budgeted in for precisely that, which was payment for the co-researchers. So the short answer is not yet. The long answer is yes, that is our absolute intention if we can finally get this project funded. The reason we need funding is both to do that, but also to extend the project, because our desire is to extend beyond Highgate Park to other institutions. And in fact, we have had support. In fact, the organisations, partner organisations who wanted to come in on the ARC linkage have a vested interest in ensuring that the clients that they represent also have a chance to share their stories. So the long-term vision is exactly that.
Right.
Yes.
Well, thank you so much. What a fabulous project.